So let me introduce our speaker today. We're pleased to be joined by Rabbi Daniel Roslaar, who is currently the Rabbi of Alei Zion in Hendon, but is extensively educated both in Israel and in the UK. He has an MA in Jewish education from the University of London, Smicha from the Rabbanut, studied under the original Rosh Yeshiva of the Gush, Rav Amital and Rav Lichtenstein. He also has recently published a website with thousands. How many exactly, Rabbi Shirim, do you have on there?
About 1,500.
1,500 shirim on various halachic topics, which is linked in the notes for the shir. So please do check that out as well. And without further ado, Rabbi.
Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this exciting new initiative with Surba. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share Torah with you and share some thoughts on the process of the Acharonim. In the blurb for the share, which took me a little time to try and work out exactly what was heading at, but raised an number of important points in this regard, in terms of trying to work out what are the Achronim doing and what their relationship is with previous sources. I actually said that I wasn't going to share a screen, but I am going to share a screen. I want to start off with a passage from the Netziv, which came up in this particular passage from the end of Parashat Shlach Lecha, but it's a notion that the Netziv repeats in his commentary on Chumash HaMeik Tavar. This is a good introduction to the question of how the Achronim are operating. The penultimate parsha is the story of the Mekoshesh. They weren't quite sure what to do with him. They found him, and the pasuk tells us that they brought him El Moshe ve'el Aaron ve'el Kol Haida. They brought him to everybody. Rashi addresses the question: if they brought him to Moshe already and he didn't know the answer, then what was the point of bringing him to Aharon? And Rashi explains that Moshe and Aaron were together at that time, so it wasn't that they brought him first to Moshe and then to Aaron. But the Netziv actually has a different approach. And the Netziv says that Moshe and Aaron represented two different kochot, if you like, two different abilities, skill sets in terms of interpreting Torah. In terms of, this is anybody who's learned Torah and Halacha in any depth, we all know that Torah Shebichtav is the headlines. And Torah Shebal Peh is the small print, and the small print isn't included in the headlines. And there's always a question, why not? And what about stuff that's not even in the small print? So that Sib says that Moshe Aaron Hayushnei Rashi Sanhedraot, Kol Echad B'Koach Acher, each one with a different set of skills. Tikvar B'Yanu Hadiftiv B'Parashat Shoftim Ki Palin Im Chad Davar V'Atal Acharonim Alvim El Hashofet Asher Yeh B'Yamim Ha'im. Parashat Shoftim, we've got that when something's an enigma and we don't know the answer to it, so we go to Yerushalayim, to the Beit Din Hagadol, and the Kol Din She'enu Mukubal Mikvan Nechtach Al Pi Shnei Ofanim, and there are two ways of resolving every question. Afat B'deref Tivmui Milton and Milton Vabisvara, Zoi Hara'ah Pshuta Sheba'al Shah. One is looking for precedent, seeing if we can find any parallels, and okay, it's clearly not exactly the same case, but we've got precedent and we can build on that. The second way of approaching it is al pi hafrech b'klalei haTalmud pilpul shel Torah, what the Netziv repeatedly calls throughout his commentary. What the Netziv understands is really using the Yud Gimel Midot and Fahem and other klalim to go back to basics and to try and tease out from the very start what the whole topic is all about. These were different kochot that Moshe and Aaron had. In actual fact, he talks about the difference between the Kot Rishonot and the Luchot and the different kochot they brought, that the first Luchot was simply giving an ability to compare milta to milta, whereas the second Luchot gave Moshe Rabbeinu the power of Pilpula Shel Torah. And I think, even though the Civ is looking at this in its most classic sense, I think this is a very good way of understanding what the Achronim are doing. In terms of some of the Achronim, very simply, Amatami Milta la Milta. Any question that comes up, and in the title for this evening's discussion, the title said, how do something along the lines of how do the Achronim deal with topics and concepts and realities that never stood in front of previous generations. To some degree, it's not only about new phenomena, but it's a notion which also applies in ancient phenomena as well. There are two ways we'll see that the Acharonim address these issues. One is simply by looking at precedent, and the other is going back to basics. Sometimes the basics will be going back to the Achronim rather than building on all the Acharonim that have come before them. This is one of the questions in terms of psak and derek psak. There are a number of notions that we've got, one of which is halachic batra, and the question of how much do we have to use that, in what context does that apply. I would say there are two approaches in terms of their predecessors, certainly amongst the Achronim. You can either look at it as a simple case of Yeridat Hadorot, and that later Achronim don't have the reshut to argue against previous generations. They don't have the reshut to argue against Rishonim. Others look at it in terms of building blocks. Not that we're unable to say anything previous generations haven't said, but in actual fact, what we've got is the previous generations are giving us more kalim and more tools and more information, and that we've got the benefit of more information to build on. So in a moment, I'm going to give some examples, but before that, want to touch on the notion, just a question which relates to the opening title in terms of what is modern phenomena. This is one of the big questions facing the Achronim. In terms of whether you miss out Mashiv HaRuach 29 days after Simchat Torah, that's not a modern phenomenon. It often surprises me in many of the Sheilot and Shuvot of the Achronim, they are dealing with questions that haven't changed over 2,000 years. But when we talk about modern phenomena in terms of halachic issues, I think it's important to note two distinct phenomena in that regard. One is technological advances. So a good example would be heart transplants. Heart transplants 100 years ago didn't exist, and probably 200 years ago wasn't even dreamt of. Electricity, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, nobody had even conceived of such a notion. So that's clearly what we would call a modern phenomena. The other thing to consider is changing sociological realities. A good example would be the discussion around the status of Makalele Shabbat Farhesia. Whereas going back a couple of hundred years ago, it was clear that Hesia was essentially a mumar, was disassociating himself from the religious community in every sense. This is not new to the 21st century or the 20th century. It's discussed by Rabbi Akiva Eger. So going back 250, 300 years, the notion of a person being Chalel Shabbat Farhesia, but also being associated with the community of believers and practices in some way. And you've got lots of other issues as well, particularly latest issues to affect a religious society, issues to do with gender, which to some degree reflect technological changes, the ability to undergo surgeries, but also reflecting sociological changes. And these are two areas, two parallel strands, which the Achronim are dealing with. So I want to give a few examples of each genre of approach from the Achronim and take you through how we've got these two parallel streams in dealing with contemporary issues. So I want to start with the notion that really the way that one addresses any halachic issue is you look for precedents. Everything's been discussed before, if not in this exact language, but we've got a model for it elsewhere. The concept of tshuva that I want to share with you is the tshuva by Rav Ovadia Yosef, who I think is an exemplar of this genre. This is one tshuva that I'm sharing with you, but is certainly characteristic of what I think is his. So he discusses the question of whether one can light Shabbat candles using electric lights. This is a tshuva Yekavet Up, Chilek Simon Kaf Dalad. So, it's available online and in hard copies as well. How does Rav Ovadia address this tshuva? This question. His starting point is not to discuss what the Ikar mitzvah is of Hadlakat Ner Shel Shabbat, or to go through the sugyot from the Gemara and from the Rishonim, but his opening gambit is a tshuva of Yitzchak Shmuel, because the Beit Yitzchak essentially was the first of the Achronim to discuss this issue in the 19th century. He brings the Beit Yitzchak, who wasn't discussing electricity, discussing gas, but the same principles, citing what the Beit Yitzchak says in this regard. This is so Hadlakat Ner Shel Shabbat. You've got a flame and you've got a source of energy, and that's all that one needs. He then quotes other authorities, particularly the Maharshag, who disagrees with this. He points out the Maharshag's understanding of the technicalities of electricity is flawed. He then brings a whole reshima of Achronim who talk about whether electricity is a form of Aish. He quotes Hoffman and the Akiezer, and the Chazon Ish, and Rav Zevin, etc. And then he moves even to Rav Uziel's psak on the matter, and he concurs with the Rav Binyan of the poskim, and tells us that it's fine to use electric lamps for Shabbat, and Rav Ovadia's psak is you can even say a bracha on them. And I want to be very cautious with what I'm saying, because I don't want this to be misunderstood or perceived to be Hoger B'Chavod or in the Gadlus of Rav Ovadia in any sense. But I would opine that in this Teshuva he quotes one Gemara, and there's nothing original in the Teshuva at all. And that's fine. That's not said as a criticism in any sense. Anybody who reads any of Rav Ovadia's Teshuvot is immediately overwhelmed by the enormous peculiarities that Rav Ovadia has in the Rishonim, Achronim, both Rishonei and Achronei Ashkenaz, Rishonei Acharonei Sfarad, the whole gamut of the responsa literature. But it's interesting, all he's done in this tshuva is build on what other endorse and combine what other people have said on this topic. Actually, with nothing really new there. And this isn't a particular approach of Rav Ovadia. For example, there's a tshuva, and again, you could give tens of examples of tshuva of any of these authorities. For example, Dan Weiss, one of the very important Achronim of the past century. The example I want to bring is a tshuva in Chelek Gimel, Simon Lamed Daled, where he discusses the question of Jewish-owned vending machines on Shabbat. This is, on the face of it, a modern contemporary halachic issue. Vending machines didn't exist back in the day. The Vilna Gaon had never seen a vending machine. Kal vachomer, the Magen Avraham and the Taz. What does Dayan Weiss do in this tshuva? So he does delineate for us what the potential issues are, the issues of Shabbat, the issue of Sar Shabbat. He is broader in terms of giving us a conceptual overview of the topics, but he has no hesitation in building his entire tshuva around what other Achronim has said about similar sorts of cases. So he discusses the notion of when is it kinyan chal, and whether you can put into place a type of that will be chal retroactively before Shabbat, even though the person doesn't take possession of it until Shabbat, and you don't even know who's going to take possession of it. Refers us to the Tshuva of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who discusses about Pidyon Haben on Shabbat, and whether the father can give the money to the Kohen on a Friday with the intention that everything will be chal on Shabbat. He discusses that. Those concepts. He then discusses the concepts of Schar Shabbat, under which context Schar Shabbat will apply. The whole notion of Shabbat is something which applies to where your kalim are earning for you, as it were. The classic example in the Shulchan Aruch is a person who's got a merchatz and they rent it out to a nochri, and the nochri is operating it on Shabbat, so they're benefiting in some way from the operations of this merchatz on Shabbat. And is this similar? To what degree is it similar? But again, what Dayan Weiss has done, coming from a very different tradition in terms of learning and background, to a large degree, it's very similar to simply looking at how other people have discussed the same principle and reaching a conclusion about it. So I want to give a third example of this notion of being Dame Milta Milta. Whilst I'm saying this is a characteristic of the derech hapsak of the Minhag and derech hapsak of that's not to say it's the only way they do it. I think this characterizes a large part of their Tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein in Igrot Moshe Chelek Aleph Simon Mem Hey, talking about guide dogs. Can a person, in America you call them seeing eye dogs, we call them guide dogs. So can a person take a guide dog into a shul? This is, I think, quite a famous tshuva of Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe, in a certain sense, addresses it differently to the examples that I've given with Rav Ovadia and the Minhag. But in another sense, when we think about what he's really doing, we'll come to the conclusion that in actual fact, he's doing much the same as what they're doing. He starts off looking to find where the Ikar Sugya is, and he refers us to Yerushalmi, Masechet Megillah, and Bavli as well, which supports it. Yerushalmi talks about Talmid Chacham being able to go into a Beit HaMedrash with his donkey, and he builds on this notion that we see, okay, so Talmid Chacham can go into a Beit HaMedrash with his donkey, and then he looks through the Rishonim to try and understand why that should be permissible. He establishes that for a Talmid Chacham, we've got, so the Bavli says that the Talmid Chacham, essentially they can use the Beit HaMedrash as their living area, and they can eat and drink there. So he comes to the conclusion that something must be establishing for us the notion that Talmid Chacham's donkey is on the same level as for them. And that's the rubrics under which it must be permitted. Then he has a discussion, again, bringing the Rishonim and the Achronim as to whether this will apply only b'shat hadchak or not b'shat hadchak. And he references the Mishnah Brura, who says that for Bati Knesset Shabbavel, b'shat hadchak, you can eat and drink. The person could bring in their donkey, and then he brings down from Minhag. He says, you're looking at Chassidish Batei Medrash, they're always having a climb after a yacht site at the back of the shul. So that shows the Minhag of recent generations has been that we follow Shitat Rashi and the Rishon. It doesn't need to be Shat Tadchak. Essentially, that's in terms of what is a seeing eye dog. A seeing eye dog is no different to the cases that the Gemara has discussed. He does, I would say, as in a revolutionary idea, to some degree, discusses the point that for a blind person, that a seeing eye dog for them is much more than get a big shout out cut, because otherwise they'd never be able to go to shul. And he factors that into the equation, and he comes to the conclusion that, of course, they can take their seeing eye dog into the shul. Now, Rav Moshe skim, and this is a short, simple teshuva, be misrepresentation of him to say that that's as simply as he addresses his entire response to literature. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that a characteristic of his derech halimud, in terms of halachic terms, is to look at what sugya are we talking about, what have previous generations said about it, try to understand the sugya through that, obviously developing a particular approach within those shitot, and to reach a solution that way. But I would say it's the concept of being medame milta lemilta. So that's the first way that many of the Achronim deal with issues, both of contemporary relevance and timeless relevance. But there is another approach, a more creative approach and a more back to basics approach, or if we want to borrow the terminology of the Netziv, an approach which I would say is really looking at exercising pilpula shel Torah and going back to a starting point. We'll finish off by looking at one of the best exemplars of this in current times, Rav Osher Weiss. We'll discuss some of his tshuvot in Minchat Asher in a few moments, but it can be traced back several generations as well. An example that I would give would be from the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan very often will go back to the beginning of a sugya and learn it through to come to a different conclusion that other Acharonim do. I very often use the Aruch HaShulchan when I'm learning Gemara. I find the Aruch HaShulchan very helpful Acharon in terms of understanding what. In any event, there's a mission in Masechet Shabbat. You're not allowed to fold clothing on Shabbat. This appears in the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Shin Bet. It's the notion that many people are aware of. People on Shabbat not folding up their talitot. Because of this, so that you're not allowed to fold kalim. That seems to be what the is telling us. The way the Mishnah Brura and the other Achronim paskin, you can't fold your talit on Shabbat. Sefer Shmuel Hilchata even tells us that you're going to wear a different pair of trousers on Shabbat day to the ones that you wore on Friday night, because you don't want to be seen in the same color suit twice on Shabbat. Hang it up carefully on the hanger in the creases is a problem. This is in Siman Shin Bet, Yud Yud Aleph Yud Bet. The Aruch HaShulchan goes back to the beginning of the sugya, and he looks at what type of kippur kalim were they talking about in the times of Chazal. He says that in actual fact, we're talking about not just folding your clothes to make sure that they stay in the creases. He says it's really putting pleats into an item of clothing. In the old days, you'd wash whatever it is, your skirt or your shirt, and it's supposed to have pleats in it, and those would come out in the wash. And after it's been washed, you'd fold it very tightly, perhaps put it under the bed or sit on it, but fold it very tightly to reintroduce the pleats. And he has a discussion there whether this whole din of Ein Mekapling Kalim b'Shabbat, whether it's a din in Tikkun Kli, or whether it's a din in Tircha and Hachana. And he demonstrates from Rishonim, it's a machloket, and he comes to the conclusion that most Rishonim are of the opinion that it's to do with Tikkun Kli, and that just putting something back into its original folds is not Tikkun Kli at all. So what the Aruch HaShulchan is doing here, and in another context, we could have brought many examples of this, but this is important introduction to the other notions that we're going to see. It's really, he's going back to basics and trying to understand what are the issues here, what are the conceptual issues here that we're dealing with, and then to develop it through, and this is something which is timeless, it's not just in the 20th or 21st centuries, that people have clothing on Shabbat they want to fold, and he's bucking an entire trend in terms of the Achronim. Most of the Achronim are being in the path that the Mishnah Brura ends up on, which is why he ends up on that path, because the Mishnah Brura very, very much is building and concerned about what the previous generations of Achronim will say. Whereas the Aruch HaShulchan has got, and again, I'm being careful in my language, I'm going to say the self-confidence, and that doesn't mean to say that the others aren't self-confident. They're self-confident in different ways, but the Aruch HaShulchan has got the self-confidence to go back to the very essence of the sugya and say, hold on, what is this sugya all about? And let's see if we can develop a halach about it. This is a notion, I think, perhaps championed in some way by the Brisker dynasty. You go back to his whole way of approaching halakha and limud haTorah, which are essentially indivisible, by looking conceptually at what's going on here and how we're to understand and then apply those concepts. But him was very comfortable to go back to the beginning of the sugya, to look somewhat at the Rishonim, but the fundamental, but sometimes even without that, establish what this discussion might be conceptually, and then come to a conclusion which is at odds with the conclusion of the other poskim. So Reb Chaim essentially was a lamb. He didn't make it his life's work to be a posek, but he certainly applied these concepts in a halachic sense, very often leading to brisker chumras, which aren't mainstream with everybody else, but will relate to a fundamental understanding of lots of Reb Chaim's Torah. There's Reb Chaim al Harambam. Beyond that, a lot of it is Torah Shabbat al Peh. But for example, Chaim's approach to tefillah is using tefillah, to the role of the notion of the tefillah of the tzibor and the tefillah on behalf of tefillah tzibor and tefillah tzibor. In its Sefer Shim V'Shitot has a large number of examples of how Reb Chaim looks at things conceptually and will then come to a halachic conclusion. He tells one of the examples that he gives is somebody came to Reb Chaim with a big china against the Chevra Kadisha. So two people in town had died. This fellow's off was the person who died first, and somebody else died after him. When it came to the Levaya, all things being equal, you bury the one who died first. But the Chevra Kadisha buried the second one first. This fellow was very much aggrieved that his relative had been buried second, and he wanted Reb Chaim's psak on this. Reb Chaim's response was, after looking at the Rambam, that this is an issue which I have to speak to the Chevra Kadisha about, but it's not an issue that you need to be concerned with. So the people with Reb Chaim, Rav Sevin says Dina Brumsky, before Dina Brumsky was Dina Brumsky, Rabbi Brumsky was with Reb Chaim on that occasion, and this happened. I want to know, how, if it's an issue, why is it nothing to do with the Carol? Reb Chaim's response was, we have to look at this halacha of burying the one who died first and look at it conceptually. Is this a din klali that we've always got a principle that you encounter two mitzvot, you have to do the one that you encounter first before moving on to the second one? Or is this a specific halacha in Kavod Hamet? Chaim said the fact that the Rambam doesn't discuss it indicates for us that it's just a general halacha in Klalei HaMitzvot, the Tema Avruna HaMitzvot. Therefore, he as Rav of the town needs to address why the Chevra Kadisha aren't doing things correctly, but it's also Pagama in the particular mate, and therefore it's nothing to do with the Balabai who came to him. Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, and perhaps to a greater degree, Rav Soloveitchik, also had this self-confidence in being able to go back to the fundamentals of the sugya and get it to lead them to halachic conclusions, very often halachic conclusions which are at odds with the normative. A very famous example of Rav Soloveitchik would be that Rav Soloveitchik held that when you're lighting Ner Chanukah, you say the bracha of Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, you light the first of the lights, and then you say the bracha of Sha'asanissim, and then you light the second of the lights. Now, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch tells you that you say all the brachot before you light the Ner Hanukkah, and none of the Achronim, unless they're quoting Rav Soloveitchik. The modern Sfarim will sometimes say it in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, or not in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, depending on what perspective those Sfarim are coming from. But essentially nobody, maybe Reb Chaim, had lit Hanukkah candles differently, based on a discussion about the nature of these. Is the bracha of Sha'asanissim, it's a Birkat HaMitzvah on Pirsulei Nisa, or is it Birkat HaRe'iyah and Birkat HaShvach on seeing the Ner Hanukkah lit? And that leads him to this very novel conclusion. Perhaps even more radically, going back to fundamentals, for example, was of the opinion that when blowing a shvarim on Rosh Hashanah, that you need to have 4 bars in your shvarim rather than 3 to tick all the necessary boxes. And so what we see is a notion of going back to fundamentals and visiting the sugya. Again, if you look in the chapter on the Rogatchover had a very novel way of addressing halachic issues. But he wasn't interested in what the Achronim of previous generations had said, unless it was perhaps in terms of introducing a concept. He was happy to create his own concepts and look at issues from the perspective of Pula Shel Torah. I want to finish with 3 examples of Rav Osher Weiss, because Rav Osher Weiss perhaps combines these approaches of Badam and Milta, and also is breathtaking Pula Shel Torah and his ability to create new concepts. In terms of, there seem to be, one could say there are 2 approaches. Some will take the approach that there's nothing new that Shas and Chazal and the Rishonim didn't address. You just got to find how and where they address it. Principles for everything are there. The other approach, which is an approach that Rav Osher Weiss takes, is that there are certain things which never olal adat with, and they never give us any yardsticks with which to measure these things, and we have to create our own new concepts. Very famously, Rav Osher Weiss has a number of on the subject of electricity on Shabbat. Gimel of Minchat Asher. Now, Rav Osher Weiss obviously isn't the first to discuss electricity. He was dealt with in great detail by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach almost 100 years ago, dealt with by the Chazon Ish. But Rav Osher Weiss is addressing it freshly. And he introduces a whole new idea, really. Rav Osher Weiss brings really his halachic mechanism here is that he says that electricity, and I'm summarizing pages and pages of Tshuvot in 1 or 2 minutes here, but what Rav Osher Weiss says is that there are 39 Avot Melachot, and every one of the Avot Melachot has 39 Toladot, and Chazal knew what was mutter and what was asur on Shabbat, and anything that was asur on Shabbat, they knew it was asur, but they couldn't fit it into anything, is the Toladah Makeh B'Patish. And he says that's how we have to regard electricity. He says his starting point is electricity must be asur on Shabbat. It's inconceivable that it could be permitted, because he says otherwise we would lose the whole nature of what Shabbat is all about. If electricity was permissible on Shabbat, Shabbat would simply become like Yom Kol. Pretty much everything that you can do during the week, nowadays, controlled by electricity, you could do it on Shabbat. There'd be no limitations on anything. And that's his starting, and then he'll bolster it by bringing various sugyot. But he's starting off from a point that this must be os. And being Makadesh why it should be Osa. Okay, he brings from the Rambam that it needs to be Shvita HaNikeret Kol. He brings a Chatam Sofer as well about the notion of what Shabbat is about. That's essentially his working position. He discusses cases of people opening new businesses, making inventions that put other people out of work. claims that you're taking somebody else's parnas away from them. You can't use the models that previous Achronim were talking about, because they were talking about very simple economic societies. We're talking about a much more complex society. And if we would take this narrow approach, there'd never be any development in terms of technological progress, economic progress, societal progress. And all these things are foundations that we have to bring into our halachic discussion. And in a number of cases in Koshen Mishpat issues, these are things that he says. He says the realities were different to the realities of today. So he talks about Hastarat or Vashemesh. In terms of Chazal, you build a house. These are sugyas in Bava Batra. You build a house, and then somebody comes and builds a house and obscures your view. The fact that you were able to see the Sydney Opera House out of your window one day, and now they've built something in front of it and you can't see it any longer. Nowadays, there's a value put on a view. If you've got a house with a view of the Sydney Opera House, it's worth millions more than the same apartment next door, which is something built in front of the windows. And therefore, he's willing to introduce new concepts and say, no, what Chazal was talking about is just not relevant to the reality today, and we've got to approach it from a different perspective. So these are some of the ideas I wanted to share with you, and develop this idea that the Achronim had two ways of addressing things. That's Madamim Milta on the one hand, and Pilpula Shel Torah on the other hand. It's certainly not for me to say which one is better. From a Londa's perspective, obviously there's much more excitement in one of them than in the other. But I would suggest that one needs to be immensely powerful and confident to be able to adopt the second approach rather than the first approach. But with an ever-changing world, both in terms of technological developments and societal developments, I think we're ever more in need of those to go back to Pilpula Shel Torah and examine things from the very first concepts. Hopefully, some food for thought for people to consider.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. That was perfect. If I may ask a question, in this model, does the person who's employing the second model need to be qualified in any way, or is it just the quality of the argument? And a tangential question to that is, where does Masorah come into it? And is that even a thing in the second model or only in the first model?
Well, they're both interesting questions. In terms of your first question, I think that one needs an extraordinary breadth and depth of the sugyas to be able to engage in Pilpula Shel Torah. In terms of to create the concepts, I think one needs to have that panoramic view of all of Shas and the concepts to then be able to come and create the new concepts. In terms of to know what's already been, how a concept will be created. I think to come up with the radical conclusion, I've learned one sugya in my entire life. I think you still need the precedent in terms of being able to see what the scope is for that creativity. It's almost if a person's only read one book in their life, and then they decide they're going to become a poet or an author, saying, okay, I'm going to come up with a whole new idea based on the fact that I've got some experience in literature. One needs to have much more vision there than limited sugyas. In terms of the Masorah, I think primarily here we're talking about issues where there is no Masorah, and that's the point. Chaim and Rav Soloveitchik and the Rogatchover, they were willing to go even against the Masorah. This is perhaps a slightly wider question about how we define Masorah bound by what. Or, I think you and I, when we've learned together, there's a discussion we've often had in terms of, okay, fine, the Mishnah Brura says something, but how binding is that on every generation that comes and every Ashkenazi Jew that comes afterwards? Is it or isn't it? But perhaps this is one of the beauties of innovative situations in terms of there is no Masorah there. And perhaps in a certain sense, it gives the posek that ability to, and when I'm talking about poskim, I'm not talking about you or me, people of world-class stature. It gives them that ability to be less constrained. I remember once hearing Moriv Rabbi Harav Lichtenstein saying, in terms of Reb Chaim, he said, when Reb Chaim paskened to Shaila, Reb Chaim basically used the Rambam and the Rif and kept an eye on the Shulchan Aruch to make sure that he wasn't going too far out of the normative paths. So even Reb Chaim had an eye on the normative paths in some way. But I think it will depend on every issue, and Masorah is something which Jewish learning and Jewish life is built on, but different people will cover different perspectives defining what Masorah is. And there is definitely a distinction, I would say, between a Masorah that can be traced continuously from the Gemara through the Rishon to the Achronim, even though one could take times of the Onim or times of the Rif in a different direction, but it didn't, saying this is the Igrot Moshe Paskins X, this is the Masorah, and we're all bound by it. And I think very few people who are really serious in learning would take it to practice, because so many people since Rav Moshe have argued. There will be people who take it to practice. But I think a Masorah needs to go back more than 1 or 2 generations to give it the status of a Masorah going back to Sinai.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi. We really appreciate your time and that you gave us, and we hope to host you again sometime soon.
Thank you. It was great for me to have the opportunity to think about these issues. Thank you so much. Fatzlacha to everybody.